we are in a forum where celebrating disruptors for better, disruptors for good, or in other words, value creators. In this session, we are going to talk about possible value destroyers and particularly digital security. So, my role is to moderate this session with three experts. I'm privileged personally as the editor of the Daily FT to be moderating such a panel of senior as well as skilled and experienced resource persons. I have Sujit Christy, Director, Layer 7, Hassen, Managing Director, Sri Lanka of Quantei, and Jerome Samarasinghe, Vice President of Strategic Initiatives, Asia Pacific and Middle East for SecureOps. The objective is to make some initial questioning or moderation and then open it up to the audience, and I really look forward for the audience to make use of these experts to clarify or even raise some points, because you're coming from a startup ecosystem, people who are in the whole ICT sphere, so please make use of that. I'll start with a general question to the panel. Why should startups even consider cybersecurity or digital security? I'll start up with Ima, maybe give your own perspectives as well as certain assertions you have.
Sure. So today startups take on completely new disruptive areas as their focal point for business. For example, we look at where it's ride sharing, where Uber spun off in a big way, whether it's Airbnb or whatnot. Ultimately, we are finding new ways to bring services to consumers. And together with that comes about the need to collect consumer data, information about your customers, information about other participants, their behaviors and whatnot. So the more information you start collecting, you start realizing, hey, I'm running a fairly well-sized risk here. I'm potentially the single point of risk for my customers. I spoke to a few startups outside who are in health, in the medical industry. That takes it one notch further. They're now collecting very sensitive data. So when you start looking at the kind of information that you're collecting, the basic question that I ask every startup, or I ask ourselves often as a company that sells to startups and to larger companies, if you know what you know about the way in which you store information, would you do business with yourself? So that's the first set of thoughts that I want to get this started with.
Thanks, Jerome.
Well, for me, in terms of security, it's always about protecting the brand, right? I mean, startups have a lot to gain and they've got a lot to lose in the initial onset. So from a security aspect, it's always about protecting the assets that you've identified, as well as being able to secure and protect your brand in terms of building that brand, retaining whatever the credibility that it has in the face of what's out there. So we're in an, the internet seems to be prevalent, and that's our sort of ecosystem. That's where we work in. And it's also the most insecure and probably the most, vulnerable ecosystem that you could think of. I mean, you've got enough and more threats out there, enough and more actors and whatnot who want to basically make your life and your product and your business a sort of it's almost like a game that they play against you, But in the end, what happens is it's your credibility that's at stake. It's your business that's going to suffer. So for me, security means about protecting that brand and retaining that credibility.
I think a lot of new ideas or startup is usually or typically addressing a problem area which the traditional products don't address. But for me, from a security point of view, the products which you develop or the services you offer may not be limited to one geography per se. So when you're looking at, or when we look at, you're looking at these products being used by different people in different geographies, which means we are looking at different cultural, legal, and regulatory requirements. Because when we are looking at security, we not only just look at privacy or security per se, but also from a legal perspective. So there is a whole lot of things which we will have to consider when you roll out a product, right? So with that, I mean, I'll get Nisthar to, take the discussion forward, and I think we'll have a lot more based on the questions you ask.
Thank you very much. I personally feel that the startups on their own have their set of challenges. You spoke about brands, you spoke about customers, you spoke about territory markets that may be serving. Given their own challenges, one is firstly perhaps focus on funding, getting the business going or the startup going. You think at what stage should they start looking at, should they have security from day one, or you think general tendency is that to make it the last? What would be your advice? Should it be part of your own development process, or should it be at the middle or at the end?
Great question. So when you build a house, do you put in the locks at last after you move in and moved your stuff in? You probably don't. Security is as important for your startup as it would be to any other business anywhere else in the world. We tend to hear a lot about the kind of markets we go into, the size of the market we operate in. Sometimes I even hear, oh, we're in Sri Lanka. And I know most of the startups here would want to sell to outside of Sri Lanka, as Sujit said. The territories that we focus on are much greater, much broader. So we see the world as a flat plane. If you've got an IP address, you are vulnerable, you are at risk, which means security should be a consideration both into your technology as well as into your business practices in how you see the likelihood of a breach, the risk, and so on at the very early stage. So day one or even before.
Jerome?
Well, I mean, security, I think a lot of the security sort of bodies, the organizations, they're kind of promoting, and rightly so, they're promoting security by design. Being, this audience is mostly of startups and most of your things are applications. And designing security at the onset into your, whatever the framework, your application, whatnot, it'll actually, that kind of saves you in the long run, because there's a limited amount of protection that you'll gain by protecting the perimeter, by using hardware, whatever it may be. But if you build the security into your application itself from the onset, that would probably be that is what's been advocated, and I would say that would be the way to go.
Yeah, see, as Imai and Jerome mentioned, security by default, right? So it has to be considered right at the inception stage. Now let's look at a typical application. Some of your applications would use a geo coordinate, like it might use the GPS position, or it might use the camera, it might use the microphone. Now if there is a vulnerability in any one of the codes you write, can a third party who has malicious intent, can he start monitoring people the way they use the application, right? So when we develop the application, we would say, okay, these features are essential. But we would also have to look at, if something were to go wrong, what should you be doing? Or how would you prevent something going wrong? The second thing is, if you don't consider security at the requirement stage, and you think, okay, security can be added on later, like a plaster, the cost typically would be about 20 times or more. And that's the global statistics, right? So if you're going to spend $100 making the initial product, and when your end users or your customers, they demand compliance or security to your product, and if you were to patch it, you're going to do a catch-up game, and you're going to spend 20 times more than your initial investment, and which would mean the competition is going to take advantage.
Thanks. So the key take from this answer is that security should not be an afterthought. Okay. I'd like to engage the audience, some of the participants who may have gone through such stage, in whether at what point did you make a decision? Do I have any startup people in terms of who have gone through that and took the decision to start with security first? I'd like someone to share your own insight. Anyone in the audience? Is it easy as what the experts say, or you have other pressing priorities as a startup? Please. Yeah.
I can just ask this. So when we started our startup, security was one of the main concerns. My requirement, I do not have tech background, so my requirement to the service provider was to make sure that is their paramount, I guess, focus. And I got some of my friends who had that knowledge to give some industry guidelines and gave it to them and told them, make sure that you are adhering and meeting these expectations. Having said that, I do have my own doubts in terms of whether it was properly executed. So the next stage is... Thank you. So the next stage is probably getting a consultant or another third party to come and do a security evaluation. I totally agree with you. There is a huge gap in that area, and when I really look at the group, I think everybody should be sitting here, because that's really a serious thing. Before we go to market anything, I think we need to make sure, as you said, the doors are locked and we have padlocks. Otherwise, then the brand value goes down the drain once you work hard at it. So that's my kind of preface. But the question is, what type of easy to understand material is there out there for people like me who I have a decent knowledge on physical security, but not the infrastructure, the IT side of it. So how would you advise?
Excellent. Thank you for that excellent feedback.
That's an interesting question, because that's one of the things that we were discussing prior to this, just a few minutes back. And what we find is there is a lack of, I'm not sure whether you call it ability, but the lack of I'll say ability, right. The ability to communicate to the business owners of the requirements. Now, we have entrusted a lot of our things into the realm of the IT department, the IT manager, the IT director, and thereabouts. But when it comes to the decision makers of a company, the business leaders, be it at the C-suite or thereabouts, they just do not have the relevant information to make that decision. So where the gap, as you rightly mentioned, is in that, where we do not have the communication, the right lingo and the terminology being used, and mostly it's just layman terms explaining to those that make the decision where that spend has to go in terms of, and why you need to sort of have security in the first place, because majority of the time they'll say, hey, look, you don't need security because, okay, fine, we've got, ours is just a simple app that does X, Y, Z, so why bother with security? I mean, okay, we're using certain things, it's not gonna, nobody's gonna bother with us thereabouts. So it's the ability of the technologists within the company to be able to educate the decision makers. So what I would say is, looking at, from experience, it's just a matter of having the right person there to be able to, it doesn't mean that the board has to understand technology. It's just having the right person at the right level to be able to explain to the board in the most simplest of terms why they just need to do it. There is no magic bullet for that one, so it just depends on the person, I would think, unless the gentleman can shed more light on that.
Just to
clarify the question, it's just that, let's say a person like me, can I go on a website and just read few things and just ask educated questions from the service provider? Do you have this? Do you have this? Do you have this kind of thing?
I would think there's a lot of material out there, and a lot of the organizations do. I think, Sujit, you would have a little bit more information about that,
So I'll answer this question in two parts for you. One, I would say security is all about common sense, right? I mean, technology comes second, right? So when I say common sense, let's say if you are talking about creating a user profile, what information would you be collecting? First name, last name, date of birth, is it required? Sex, male, female, right? Address, telephone numbers, email IDs. Now, in certain countries, all these information put together would be classified as personally identifiable information. So there is a law which you need to comply to. Now, let's say if it is in the context of a hospital or a medical industry, right, then you're looking at what you call analysis, or what you call in terms of certain patient-related information attached to that particular profile. So when you take an individual's information, that gives you one set of risks, but the moment you have information relating to that individual, right, health history, it might have an impact on the insurance premium he has to pay, or various other things, right? So we need to understand if these information which are collected, if it's going to be compromised or disclosed to unauthorized people, how would it affect you? Now, if you look at the UK's Data Privacy Act, which is going to become effective from May next year, 24th, if I'm correct, the date, right? So it says that anyone who is not complied to that law will have to pay 20 million euros, or 4% of the global revenue, for breach of privacy. So if we look at those 50 parameters which they have mentioned, so when you build an app, you're going to say, okay, how are we going to actually tag this? Now, for example, it's easy to say, okay, first name, second, last name, and whatever information, you classify it as personally identifiable. But the information which is in your database, and if it is going to be generated in the form of a report, what information will you pick up? And which fields, when they come together, and what is the impact it's going to have in terms of information disclosure? So I think those things have to be thought through even before you start writing the code. But traditionally, what people do is, okay, I have a requirement, I just need an app to collect percentage, register the patients. Requirement is very simple. The guy gets onto the keyboard, starts coding, comes and gives you an app, and you look at the interfaces and you say, oh, it's fine. Then comes the technological part. Where are you storing this? Who has access to it? How will you regulate access? How will you monitor who has access to it? Would you need to encrypt the data? Right? So checklists will give you a broader outline, but in terms of applicability, I think it will require a certain amount of application. But what Jerome was actually prompting me to tell you is there are certifications available for the developers, like a certification called CSSLP, Certified in System Lifecycle Professional. It tells you how to securely code. right? So today, I mean, we are trying to, get a lot of people to at least read through that material, right? Then you have the OWASP, the top 10 programs. It tells you, what vulnerabilities are usually found. And if you look at the last 10, 15 years, some of things have not changed, right? Password is one of the weakest controls, right? So earlier we had to guess. Today you have just a tool which can capture the passwords and you can use it. So how do you, store the passwords and things like that, right? So there are a lot of checklists which you can use, but the programmer has to be adequately educated.
I think the question was for a non or less techie CEO or a founder. One is how can he become comfortable that his product or service is secure, and whether a founder or a CEO can have an easy way to understand that. That's number one. That is simplifying the jargon. The other one is about getting it assessed. I think there was a gap he was mentioned about. How do you ensure, or how can a startup ensure that there is, it's more secure? I want some response from Ima as well. And please, in the audience, I'm sure I see lots of experts here. So please do share your own insights from where you're coming in terms of some of the issues that we're dabbling with here.
That's a great question, by the way. I get a lot of customers, both in the very large enterprises as well, who have the same challenge. It's not just the startups. So I know you're at when you say you're a startup, you're at an early stage of your business. We have seen customers who've been around for a long time who still don't understand the value of information or information risk itself. So how do you bring about that? How do you cover that gap between them and the right information? One of the first things that we did was be able to communicate. We, as in the business that I run, which was actually founded on that being one of the principles. Help guys like you understand security. And this is not a shameless plug, by the way. There is a huge gap in helping you understand. Yes, there is absolutely a better way to write code, as Jerome said, and as Sujit said, there are certifications that you can bring in with the right people. But also look at things like the UK privacy guidelines, and of course, I'm slightly more familiar with Australian privacy principles, APP, that has similar, penalties for both individuals and for companies who breach or who mishandle personally identifiable information. So the basics for start would be ask yourself 5 questions. If the information that we have is useful to somebody else, what can my competitors do with this? What can a malicious actor do with this information? Can they hold us at ransom? Can they hold my customers at ransom? Will our brand be affected? Will it affect us in such a way where our business might even take a hard hit? If you start asking those questions, then you kind of start understanding where the problems lie, and then you narrow down. Sometimes it's not really as technically complex as it sounds to be. It's the most simplest things. What's your natural instinct? I'll go back to my house that doesn't have a padlock at the door. Why would I lock it? It's the natural instinct for me to lock it up at night. I live in an apartment block. To be honest, even if I didn't lock it, I wouldn't mind. But I still go in and lock it anyway. So start working backwards. And sometimes it's the most simplest ways of looking at things that brings you down to the actual technical answers. But hopefully you won't need to do those yourself. At least you'll have an idea of where to go. But like I said, those principles and coding, like the guys have already added, those are key areas to start with.
Excellent. Any inputs from the audience? Any insights that you'd like to share? Okay. Excellent wrap up in terms of the ideas, but I just want to throw this to the panel. Who should take leadership? I mean, at least one person has identified himself as a startup founder. I mean, he has lots of problems and headaches. Okay, should the CEO drive this, or can he delegate it? Where does the response? Where does the buck stop? in terms of security. I want from, yeah,
Honestly, I think everybody should be involved in security. Everyone.
Okay.
Starting from the janitor to the coder to the CEO,
Yeah.
CFO, everyone should be part of it.
excellent. Any other ideas where someone has really delegated and still have a peaceful sleep at night? I mean, is there anyone in the audience? Because I mean, I know some CEOs basically make it very hands-on, some don't. I like the panel to sort of suggest a way forward, as well as some from the audience to really share.
From a startup perspective, I completely agree with him, because security and everything that goes along with it, you know, security ethics and every, you know, those all kind of go hand in hand. It has to be built within the organization from ground up. Every single employee is responsible. I'm going to go back to the brand thing. Is responsible for, you know, living up to the brand. You know, your company, you first put your company first. You think about your company. You do what is right for the company. So if you have the mentality that my company comes first, I do what is right by the company, then automatically, whether it be security, whether it be ethics or thereabouts, all of these things will fall into place, because you will try to protect what is yours. You know, it's not, I mean, you don't have to be a shareholder to feel that it is yours, but you know, you are part and parcel of the company. Whether you're a paid employee or you're a shareholder, you are part of that company. So that is what you got to kind of live. You got to live security day in, day out. So like he said, the janitor to the CEO, they all have to kind of fulfill the promise of keeping the brand alive and, you know, keeping the brand value, whatever it may be. Yeah, that's what.
Okay, so no question, I agree with you about everyone. Everyone's got to take an ownership on security. But one of the little bits that I'm going to add is that there's a massive misconception in the world outside of ours, which is the security world we live in. We live this, so everything that we do is with that at the back of our minds. There's nothing called absolute security. You just, you know, bear that in mind. So it does not mean that I'm going to build this amazing piece of technology and I'm going to make $1 million with sell it for 99 cents on the App Store and it's 100% secure. You're just, you know, putting yourself in a place that you just can't come out of. Right? Security is about the right balance between being able to protect what it does, be available to my audience at the right time while still preserving the confidentiality of the information. I sound like a classic CISSP now when I say that. So those are the 3 pillars of security. You have to have the right balance. So when it comes to understanding that and you implement that into your organization, yes, the buck stops with you. You are the owner and you are the startup founder, owner, or even a CEO in a slightly bigger environment. Regardless, every person in your organization has got to understand what's the value of whatever it is that we're working with, brand, customer data, compliance goals, what have you. And you would eventually trickle that down into the organization through you could use a complex word like policy, which sounds rather boring, but it could simply be implemented into your behavior, into how you handle data. If you're running a startup environment and you start collecting 20,000, 30,000 user records, start asking who has access to that information. Who can get into my production database at a random time without the right controls in place? When you start asking those questions about how your operations run, again, I will come back to saying, if you knew that, would you do business with yourself?
Any inputs from the audience in terms of, yes, please do. I want it to be very interactive so that we are discussing what is relevant and not irrelevant in terms of security.
I will throw a generic question to the panel. What is your advice on startup like whether we should go for perimeter security or appliances or just forget about everything and wait till the national SOC or something comes where you can get a clean pipe? Because you talk about ransomware nowadays and endpoint security, and you have the best core firewall, but you end up in having some vulnerabilities.
Excellent. Lovely. Panel, who likes to answer that?
Okay,
Sujit?
I'll go first and then the panel can help me address this. Right, so a little while ago, Imar did mention there is no 100% security. So to substantiate that, what we need to look at is what is that we are trying to protect? What is our crown jewels? So in order to protect the crown jewels, the first thing we need to look at is secure coding. Right? Before you even start looking at technologies about perimeters, firewalls, and various things. So the coding has to be secure, requirements has to be properly documented, changes have to be structured, proper assessment in various stages. Now, some of the places where we have done work is we've even done the assessment even before they start coding at the requirement stage itself. So a lot of things can be identified at that stage. And when you actually have a product ready for deployment and you're just doing a pre-assessment, so you're only just tweaking it to fine-tune it. So in order to host the application, you may host it in your data center or you might host it in the cloud. So who is going to use the application? Who's going to have access to it? What level of access are you going to give? So depending on this, you will also substantiate this with a proper risk assessment. You're going to continuously identify what is my threat. Can ransomware affect me? What is the way the ransomwares will affect me? Do I have a proper patch management program? Do I have continuous backups in place? Where do I store my code? Who has access to my code? Right? So you will start asking those pertinent questions and then you will find your own answers. Right? So it's more of non-technical stuff. Then once you have your basic work done, then you're just going to engage a professional and ask, okay, we've done all this due diligence. Tell us, are we missing anything else? Right? Let's say if you're going to host it in your data center, then we might say, okay, your firewall is now only working at the network layer. We need an application layer firewall to protect your application. But that does not mean that you can have an insecure code which is protected by an application firewall, because it can be still breached. Right? So no right or wrong answer. It's a continuous process.
But the suggestion is build your defenses on
Build
your own.
defenses. Identify
Before-
your threats and build your defenses.
Ma, anything?
Yeah, I'm going to add a little bit to, or rather take on some of the points you noted in your question. Should we have a perimeter firewall? Should we wait for the national SOC and so on? So you had a few bits in there. I don't know if I'm answering your question directly, but I'll say something that I picked up. We tend to always think as traditional companies, as well as even more so as startups, that attacks always come from the outside. Hence, your thought towards the firewall and whatnot, firewall being a very natural, first port of call. Things don't go wrong always from the outside. Insider breaches, which mean, something as simple as your data being stolen or leaked, all the way down to code snippets going missing, to mistakes, unintentional insider attacks. They fall into the attack category because it incidentally affected your business, but they're unintentional. Things happen at the inside. So while you spoke about so many different pieces that come together, where should you start? You should start looking at design, like Sujit said, and like Jerome also added on a little earlier. But even more so, understand your business model. Whose information am I collecting? And then start looking at the right tools that actually protect that type of information or that type of data. Both data in transit as well as data while it's resting. Often we say, okay, great, look, I've got SSL certificates in, I've got encryption while the thing moves from point A to point B. We don't often look at what happens when it's sitting on my storage or my database. So consider those and how important is it for that. And surely some of these stuff will add both an overhead for you operationally, because you got to make sure that it runs properly and you got to have the right people in, and you'll also have challenges from a technical perspective. Encryption, for example, is not the easiest resource on your, easiest burden on your CPU, right? So factor that in early on. And that will save you from spending that 20 times more that Sujit spoke of later on. When you start bringing security in much later, it becomes a change to the business, the process, and ultimately, people, you might have even lost some business at the very beginning, which was the time that you really needed business, when your startup was taking off. So consider it early on.
Excellent. Yeah.
Just to add one point to what Ima mentioned about encryption, right? It's essential, right? We say, is your data secured when it is in storage, at rest, when in transit, when in use? Recently we were talking to a startup. The standard answer which we kept getting is, if we use encryption, it will slow down the process. But then they are dealing with sensitive information. So do we look at performance and sacrifice security, or we look at security and compromise on performance? But my argument for that was, this should have been thought through even at the initial stage. You should have said, okay, we are going to use this. This is the kind of throughput we need in terms of the processing power. Right? Jerome, to you.
Well, with regard to startups and these sort of environments, I guess you do need a combination of all these components that you spoke of. But then again, I mean, does a startup actually have the ability to hire, you know, a professional to look at it on a continuous basis? So, I mean, that's where you kind of have to, you know, step back and say, hey, look, you know, I need security from day dot. But then again, I don't want to be hiring resources that, you know, that are going to concentrate and look at this all the time. So that for me, what I'll say is, hey, look, you know, there are lots of companies out there who made it their business to know what's happening in this field. You know, you've got to leverage that. You know, and you know, and I think Ima can, you know, expand on this a little bit more, because we are under the misconception that security is a very expensive option. So that is something that I think we need to kind of clear up, and it's something that we need to, you know, sort of start incorporating in our environments from day dot. So what you call, so I mean, Ima, you want to add on to that?
Yeah, thanks. Traditionally, with anything technology, security is just one of those things. You're going to think of buying that box or that license or that piece of technology. We think of things from you know, what is it going to cost me for the next 3 years, and then buy that box, you know, based on my expectation of performance and scalability and whatnot. But today, you don't have to be there. The great thing about today's world, in that 2.0 kind of world that a lot of the startups operate in, you don't have to buy a lot of technology up front. You can leverage subscription services, managed services, otherwise OpEx models that let you consume, pay as you kind of consume, and scale up very easily. Almost all of you would be familiar with AWS and Azure and Google Cloud and so on. You're doing it already. So it's just a matter of saying, how can I build the different security tools into my technology stack together with this? And then, of course, just to add to that, it's not just the technology. Often the services are also available along that same line, in that same subscription kind of model. When I say services, things like incident response, basic visibility into your environment. You don't have to be one of those big organizations that spends $1 million on a SOC to have that visibility. Today you have access to that. So leverage it.
Thank you. What's the feedback from the participants? Is the panel really answering your questions or not? Okay, you have a question? No, great, okay. Okay, great. I want to be more interactive, but I'll throw up one this was discussed, but I'm rephrasing this question. Are investors putting security as a priority in funding? Are they asking those questions? For that, I want input from the audience and from the panel, where the customer is demanding security. You see, unless something happens, nobody realizes you're vulnerable, right? So when it is not happening, or there is no way of finding out, I just want to know what the funding community, are they making it a priority so that there is one, if there's security, customer is willing to pay a premium, and if the business is looking at security from day one, are investors lining up? Okay, I want, we are supposed to wrap it up. I'll ask the panel to focus on the customer perspective, and I wish somebody from the audience will come share their own experience with the funding people put security as a priority.
From a customer perspective, it's different regionally. I mean, we've got mature markets like in North America and Europe, and then we have the fledgling markets of Asia. So the adoption rate and the the realization that security is an integral part of their product, it's at different stages. So you've got Asia is, I mean, though Singapore is like the #1 in terms of cybersecurity, the markets in Asia as a principle are still immature. They still do not, I mean, they're starting to talk about security, but they still don't see the requirement for the investment. I mean, that's what we've been hearing over the last couple of years. We're fairly new to the region, so that's our take on it.
My question was whether the customer is willing to pay a premium. Yeah.
In the mature markets, yes, definitely. They are willing to pay the premium because they feel the pain. They know exactly what's at stake and what they are, the consequences of not doing so. So they are willing to pay that premium.
Fine. Ima, any quick response?
That premium is tied very closely to the kind of comfort that you bring me. Something as simple as eBay. If you are buying something on eBay, right, you look at the number of stars and the ratings on the seller. There are many times when I've actually chosen not to buy from someone or pay 50 cents more for something, 50 cents being just any figure really, for half a star more, right? I've done that, and I feel a little more confident. So that confidence is what you're really selling. And very often you'll see that customers are willing to pay that price. Yes, there will be a time at the very beginning, we're not living in a bubble, so we know there's that challenge of getting ourselves onboarded. Right after that, you'll see that customers will choose you if you're slightly more secure, or you give them that comfort, versus someone who offers, in this business, $1, 50 cents, whatever cheaper, because they want to be more profitable by compromising on security. You'll often see that you'll have a better retention of customers and a better growth trajectory in that sense. One bit that I also want to add, Nisthar, is that a lot of startups here tend to be driven by technology anyway. That's essentially the engine in which we run. And we tend to think that because we are tech guys, we can build security, or we understand somewhat about security. What can anybody else tell me? All the way down to, I can't afford it, so I'll do it myself. Don't do that. Just like, there are different functions of the business that you probably wouldn't take on. You'd consider your core business to be your area of focus. If you don't have the dedicated skill set or expertise, or the person, resource, what have you, try to talk to guys who can. And very often, even if you don't have the ability to rent out or hire that service, bring that resource in, just reach out to people who are in the trade, and very often we're willing to help, even if you're not buying from us.
Excellent. Sujit, quick one?
Quick one. I look at the customers in two aspects. One is the corporate, and the one is the regular retail customers. So if you look at the individuals, as the awareness grows or when they become aware about the security aspects, definitely they'll start demanding, or they will stop using an insecure app. The corporates have definitely started emphasizing a lot, and they demand security, and they're willing to pay a premium because the brand value, the reputation is at risk.
Any inputs from the audience before we close? Okay, we've been asked to wrap it up because anyway we started late. Thank you very much for the panel. I think they deserve a nice round of applause in terms of keeping the subject alive, because security is not so exciting in terms of as a panel. And thank you very much for the audience for making it interactive. And thanks the ICT as well. Thank you very much.